31st of March.
And what type of day? Do we have a nice day?
It was a terrible day. It's raining, miserable.
I'm very sorry that it was. I like always sunshine.
Yes, so do I.
Because it brightens the spirit and all that.
But it makes a big difference, doesn't it?
For me, it affects me tremendously.
Yes.
It affects me. I never make an interview or anything special, you know. When I want something to get some money, extra, an increase of budget, unless it's a beautiful day. Now, Professor Cammann, you did not graduate from the University of Pennsylvania. However, in what capacity did you come to the University of Pennsylvania?
Dr. Bada was about to go and leave, and he needed someone to take his place in the China department. And I had taught Chinese informally to people in the American Navy in China in my spare time when I was in Chongqing. And I'd never had any proper training in Chinese, so I was not a good teacher. I didn't enjoy the language teaching because I had no training in linguistics. But I also gave a course in Chinese art and archaeology and one in Japanese art and archaeology, and I enjoyed those. And then later I taught the history of Southeast Asia and the history of Central Asia, and finally a course in Islamic art and architecture.
How do you happen to know Dr. Bode?
Because in those days there were not very many Chinese scholars, and he was a very famous one. And I think I met him at one of the American Oriental Society meetings. And I think it was he who suggested I come to the museum. And the museum must be my main job, but I also had a place in the Department of Oriental Studies. And I enjoyed that particularly much. There were very many interesting people. There was Dr. Spicer, who was the head, and there was Sam Kramer, who also had a position in the museum. And Norman Brown was a wonderful fellow. He was teaching Sanskrit, had a great sense of humor. He could be stern and even overbearing at times, but whenever he told a story, he had a very rich ability to make it very colorful, and we liked him very much.
So your experience, that means that when Dr. Bode invited you to teach Chinese, it was difficult to get a Chinese instructor then? That's the reason?
I think that was part of the way. There were not many people who could teach Chinese, and there were only 2 or 3 students who were very patient and understanding with my efforts. I think I mentioned to you before that I didn't have much ability at the tones, because I had learned to speak in Changsha in central China, where there was a very, almost a strange dialect. And then I had gone to study in Peking. And then in the course of my life, I've been to every province in China. And each one has its own different dialectic forms.
Why have you been interested in the Chinese language, to learn Chinese and to go to China?
As a boy, I was interested only in horses and boats. And I also liked traveling in Europe. But in my final year at Yale, there was a notice in the Yale News saying, application of Yale in China closed yesterday. And I began thinking about it, and the following day I applied, and there were 52 applicants, but some dropped out, some were weeded out. There were finally 3 of us. And I was sent to China to teach at the Yali Middle School, and also in the Shanghai Hospital I was teaching medical English, which is particularly interesting because the students came from many provinces. They spoke so differently that their common language was English. And it was rather simple English, and I wanted to train them to be able to read medical articles. So I taught them how to break up words into the Latin and Greek forms. And particularly interesting, when they wrote papers, I'd have them write about a certain well-known festival. And it was so different in each province. I enjoyed their descriptions, and some of them were vivid descriptions. The English was often terrible, but they had a gift for expression. And I got to know many of them very well. In fact, every weekend I would go out with the students, usually bicycle riding out in the country, and stay in the family farmhouses belonging to their relatives. And I learned so much about Chinese life in that way, just by staying in farmhouses and visiting the villages with the students.
When was that?
In 1935 through 1937. It was a 2-year contract. And when it expired, I wandered around China as an anthropologist, studying the tribes of West China. And I went up to Mongolia, and I went into the Tibetan borders. Then I came back through India and went up into West Tibet alone on horseback. And it was a really great experience traveling. Traveling alone, I had to speak with the people. In the last year in China, I was with Chinese people most of the time, and there were several months when I didn't speak English at all. And when I came out into Burma and began reading books, it was strange meeting what were once familiar words as old friends, but they'd dropped out of my vocabulary from lack of use.
Was the field, anthropology was your field then?
Just immense curiosity. I've always had tremendous curiosity about things that I was seeing or things that were unknown. And I never felt comfortable in a country until I began to get beneath the surface, until I began to understand how and why people thought as they did. And I've always had a gift for languages and could pick them up fairly quickly.
So that means that but your field as such as anthropology, that was your, in school, that was your major? Or
no, I just majored, because when I was a child I stuttered badly. I learned to write to compensate for because I couldn't speak well. And so in Yale I was taking mainly English courses or a course in cultural history. But it was always the great interest in cultural history because, again, it was explaining why people thought as they did. So when I came to Penn and began to talk about Chinese and Japanese art, I thought it was very important to bring in the history, the religions, the ways of thinking, so much so that the art department got rather nasty and said that I was an anthropologist rather than an art teacher. That is not true, but from their point of view, because I told them you cannot teach Oriental art in Western terms. It doesn't work. You have to explain it as they saw it to understand what they were doing, and then you understand its great beauty. It's tremendous insight into human nature. You don't see that if you study it in Western terms, learning the name of artists, his dates. That's nonsense. Names aren't important. It's the thing.
But have you seen any change on that? The approach is now? How is the approach now?
Gradually, not so much in Penn, but in other places, there's much more interest in the historical and cultural point of view. Yes, it is spreading. The idea is spreading. I used the same thing when I was teaching about the Islamic world. I think it's very important to understand how and why people think as they do. I learned a certain amount of Turkish and Persian by traveling in those countries. I did have a little of the language, and I understood the people fairly well. And it makes all the difference if you get beneath the surface that way.
Why do you think that Penn is not going through that?
I think the present teacher of Oriental art is very good, but she doesn't have that point of view. She's been trained in the West in Western terms. I think you have to. It's almost essential to have traveled deeply and to, not in modern fancy hotels, but to live with the people in their inns and walk. I walked nearly 2,000 miles in China, and in walking through the back country and stopping and talking to people in the fields and going to the popular country theaters and going to the fairs and that sort of thing, you get a sense of depth that you can never get from reading about it. In fact, it makes reading all that much richer when you have seen and can bring the images to mind as you read.
And when you your experience at the University Museum, did you go to any of the expeditions sponsored by the University Museum?
Yes.
Could you tell?
I haven't had much experience in. I had really no experience in actual digging. So first they sent me out to look for a site in Thailand, which could be. It was then called Siam, which might be dug by the museum. And every time I found a good site, a very likely one, they said, oh, but that's Buddhist. You can't dig there. It's holy ground. And I felt so thwarted. And then I also went to Indonesia to look for a possible dig and found that they didn't want outsiders to do it. They wanted to do it themselves, which was quite natural. And the same thing in India. So when I came back, the director said, well, it's been a failure. And it may have been a failure from his point of view because I didn't find an actual site. But from the point of view of knowledge gained, I was that much better teacher from the experience with Southeast Asia. So later when I came to talk about Southeast Asia, I was talking from depth and not just the books. And that was a popular course. My students enjoyed it. Then they sent me to dig in Turkey with Dr. Rodney Young, and then to Afghanistan. In Afghanistan, we dug some interesting things, but when it came to a division, the director of the museum said, remember, anything unique belongs to us. I hereby declare everything unique, which meant that he kept everything. We'd been working all summer and nothing we could bring back.
Oh, you were not able to bring anything?
No. Later they arranged that some of the coins could be brought here to study, but had to be sent back to Afghanistan. So the director said, again, you've been a failure. Actually, I worked like a dog that summer. But I said, I enjoyed it, but it's so far in my field. I like the Far East. That's what I've been trained in. And the director said, well, you have to go to, before Afghanistan, I did protest. And he said, you dig or you leave. And I would go home and my wife would say, if you go, it'll break up our marriage. And I was torn apart. I was almost on the edge of nervous breakdown with Dr. Rainey, who was a rather cruel person, saying one thing and my wife saying the other. In the end, I went to Afghanistan, and ultimately it did break up our marriage. But when I came back from Afghanistan, he said, now you must go to Ceylon. And I said, I can't. It's impossible. I still have my family. And he said, all right, leave. And I felt very desperate. The bottom dropped out of my life because I was very fond of the museum. But my wife said, you're a failure. Why don't you go into business? I had been making a great success in writing about, in fact, I'm primarily an author, and I've written more than 200 articles and several books. And I knew I should be an academic surrounding to finish that. And Oriental Studies said, well, as long as you're part of us, stay on. So I did, and then I began to teach these other courses in Southeast Asia and Central Asia, because I felt that I must pull my weight, as it were. I was still giving the course in Chinese and Japanese studies. And it was an amicable arrangement with the rest of the museum. I hated Rainey. I had very good reason to. But the rest of the museum were very good friends. And Miss Bruckner, who was the curator, said, anytime, come over and borrow things. And so I was giving the courses actually in the museum classrooms. And I'd bring out trays of Japanese and Chinese objects. I told the students, there's no use looking at things through glass cases. You don't really feel them. You've got to handle them. You've got to enjoy them. And the students felt so enthusiastic. They said, you know, we're really beginning to understand this in some depth. And that's what I was trying to do. Then at the same time, there was a head of the Bell Telephone Company who was at a dinner party. And someone said, have you seen this latest show at the Art Museum? And he said, whose is it? And she said, Van Gogh. And he said, who? Is it that Van Gogh person? And she said, Van Gogh. And he felt so humiliated that he called all his vice presidents together, and he said he was going to give them in sections, say 50 and 20 each year, would be sent to Penn, all expenses paid. They were to take classes in various aspects of human culture and science, and their wives would be paid for. They couldn't come to classes, but they'd read the same books. Then husbands and wives would go to the openings of the various shows. They'd go to operas, they'd go to ballet. and they discussed things together. As a result, several of the vice presidents never went back to Battelle. They said the world had opened up to them. They'd been grown up entirely in science, and they found there's another side of life. So it backfired in that sense, but those who did stay on said it enriched their life so much it made them broader people. And they were fun to work with because they had immense curiosity. It's as though the world had suddenly opened up to them. I enjoyed the courses with them more than almost anything else. I think it was only once a week, so, but then 2 or 3 times a year I'd take them to museums in, first in the Philadelphia area, then in Washington, and then in New York. And I enjoyed so much their reactions. They would, one or two of them had a remarkable sense of wit, and they'd usually make wisecracks, but I found later that they were absorbing more than some of the others did. And that was a great pleasure. Then I found that I was a better teacher to the students after that, too, because I began to understand my students as individual people. In fact, those friendships have lasted so that now when I go to New York or to Washington, my wife and I always have somewhere to stay with my former students. I'm a New Yorker. I used to have a lot of family in New York, but they've all moved away, and now I can stay with my students there. And I have some beautiful letters from students who said that I'd open up another world to them, and that's the deepest satisfaction. There was one time in my beginning 60s when I felt a little tired of teaching, and as I was shaving one day, I looked in the mirror and I said, "You're sort of a fool to stay around here. Why don't you retire to your house in New Hampshire and write, since writing is your forte?" And then that day I came here to the university, and in my mailbox was a letter. The letter said, "You may not remember me, but 5 years ago I sat in the second row on the far right, and I was very quiet, and your life had great pain. I could see that. It was a time when my marriage was breaking up." And she said, "I could see you in agony, but in spite of that, you were able to laugh, and you were able to tell us things in a friendly, humorous way." And she said, "I married, and my husband was a sadist, and he beat me. And as I was lapsing into insanity, the expression on your face saved me." And she said, "I've been in a sanitarium for 3 years, and now I'm released as cured. But I just want to tell you that the expression on your face, coping with your agony, helped me to cope with mine, and now I'm free." And with that inspiration, I stayed on until I was 70 teaching. But I was also a little bit worried because I didn't realize before how much just one's expression now, one's way of talking, what influence it had on the students.
Did you go back to the University Museum?
No, I was invited back to be made an honorary curator, and I think I still have that title. But I went back to help them do certain exhibits if they were doing something in Japan or China. They'd call me back to, in fact, they just asked me the other day to help on a new show. And then very often people call up from the museum and say, "Someone brought in something very interesting, we don't know what it is. Will you tell us if it has any value?" I used to do that when I was there, but I still do it occasionally. And it's been a source of great interest because sometimes they are valuable things that one would not normally see. And sometimes it's junk, then you have to be very polite and say, "That's very nice, and I think it'll look well in your house, but it just isn't museum quality." And then very embarrassing is when they ask what value. You really can't say because the market changes and enthusiasm changes. There's a definite wheel of fashion, and something is popular today, it may not be tomorrow. Meanwhile, Dr. Rainey had once been to China and hated it, and he hated China. So he wanted to sell some of the Chinese collection. I had to fight for that. And then he wanted to sell all the American Indian paintings by Catlett, which were invaluable because Catlett had been out there painting the chieftains before the Indian Wars. And I tried to block that, but Rainey overrode it. my main job was to try to hold the museum together, even though I was no longer there. And students rallied behind me, and I did have some success. I at least kept the Chinese section intact. Rainey was a man of tremendous arrogance, a tremendous self-importance, and he tried to put something in the news, not only the university news, but also the local papers, saying, Dr. Rainey says. If an expedition was having trouble, he would say, Dr. Rainey says the expedition's having trouble, it'll all work out all right. And even when they made the great discoveries at Ban Chung in Thailand, world-shattering discoveries, instead of doing honor to the man who found it, the paper said, Dr. Rainey reports that Ban Chung discoveries will revolutionize the idea of early metallurgy. And we really hated him. And we were very glad when he left. He was a man of great arrogance. There was once when he was having some kind of a party, and he wanted to put the Buddhist images on the tables. And I said, I'm sorry, but that's a religion. It meant a great deal to many people, and I think it's not right to have religious objects just as ornaments to be gawped at. And he said, I'll do what I want, and he put them on the table. Then he put on a Persian fountain, which was not very well, the foundation wasn't very secure, and it began to leak onto the Hindu books and some beautiful images and things in the storage below. And I said, you can't do this, it's ruining the collections. He said, collection be damned, we have to impress the visitors. And then I was on a TV program for several years for the University Museum, and he was the moderator. And one day we were driving back from that, and there was something coming up about the museum policy. And I said, what will the directors think? And he said, I have them in the hollow of my hand. I squeeze and they squeak. He was absolutely ruthless. And he was able to push through, because he'd appointed the directors, they were mostly friends of his, and anything he said they would do. And it was such a relief when he went, and the present director, Bob Dyson, is a splendid fellow. He has a deep integrity, he's a very honest man, a very friendly man, and he's a good diplomat. He had been a dean of the university too. It shows what difference it is whether you have an autocratic, conceited publicity seeker, or a man of integrity who has done a lot of work in the field, as Dyson has done. I think we're so lucky to have him now.
Did you see what some of the changes, very drastic changes that you have seen in the University Museum when you first came in, as the university is now?
When I first came to the museum, it was a very friendly place. There were not many curators. We felt like a family. We usually had lunch together over in the dining hall in Houston Hall, and it was just a group of very friendly colleagues. We kept discussing ideas together, and then Rainey found that he could rule better by divide and rule. He kind of split up groups. He took certain favorites and encouraged them and discouraged others, so that the sense of family was lost. I think it's being regained in Dyson, but there were a number of years there when there was a sense of competition, and the friendly spirit seemed to have temporarily disappeared. I think part of the competition came through the museum's TV program, What in the World. Rainey wanted to keep himself as the center of attention. As the moderator, he really was the center of attention. And he didn't like it if anyone began to get popular. I got a tremendous amount of fan mail, and that irritated him greatly. It also irritated Dr. Kuhn. The third member of the regular panel was Dr. Kidda, who was very, very likable, very friendly, and kept neutral in all the combats. But there was one case when something was lent by the Louvre, And other museums often lent things they really didn't know what they were in order to learn about them. And so I explained what it was, and Rainey said, "Oh, you're entirely wrong. The card says something else." Actually, I was completely right, but I couldn't, the way he did it, I couldn't say anything on the program, spoil the program. It was a strange and wonderful program. We'd come about half an hour beforehand, and they put an old shoe on the turntable, and we'd make all kinds of joking remarks about it. We had much more fun before the program began. Then the real objects came on, and as they appeared, on another table there was a bowl full of dry ice, and someone would pour cold water on it. It would make a great smoke. And by combining the camera images, they had the object to appear through the smoke, gradually appear. We didn't see the smoke because it was in a distance. We could see the thing right away. And there was something I can't understand. I mean, I don't understand the mechanism of it, but if I would touch an object, I knew almost immediately what it was. It came through the handling. I'd handled so many objects. It could be from Peru, it could be from the South Seas. And it was usually chosen to be an object that would look like as if it might have come from several areas, but when I touched it, I knew. And I was cautioned very early, I mustn't say what it was at first. I must reason, well, it can't be this because, and it can't be that because, and then it must have been made by such and such people. We had to say who made it, when, where, and why. And it was supposed to be long drawn out. Well, one time there was a fish. It was made of just an ordinary pottery fish, wasn't very spectacular. But in my mind, it came sort of a joke. I said, a fish from Kish. And Rainey said, "That's right, but you shouldn't guess it so soon." I didn't even know where Kish was. Knew nothing about it. It just came to mind.
But tell me, it's true that it's nice to handle the objects and it gives you more feeling. But does that mean that before the exhibits at the University Museum was open, that the people can
no. Everything was closed in cases, but as the curator, I'd handled so many things as they came to the museum that I sort of sensed by the texture what it was made of and probably how it was made. But also there were very strict rules in the University Museum that I could only see the things in my section, that's the Far East. And I wasn't supposed to go in the rooms of the storage, and so I was very strict and didn't do that. But I did go to other museums. In my childhood, I spent a lot of time in the American Museum of Natural History. So I would go up there and study the things in the cases and occasionally things in storage. So I came to know the things of the whole world. And I was responsible for the whole world. But there was such a rich education, and I really enjoyed the program as much as anything I did. And it was somewhat embarrassing, though. I'd be standing in a subway platform in New York, and someone would come up and they said, "You didn't do very well, Kyle, last week. I think you missed something." And I'd never seen them before. They should be calling me by a nickname. At first, I was a little bit irritated by it, never showed it. But it made me see how Hollywood people must feel. No private life at all. In the sense of always being in public view. And of course, around in Philadelphia, practically everybody knew me from having seen the program at least once.
How did the University Museum it has the same prestige and the same exposure that it has now, back in the 50s?
I would think more so, because there were more exhibitions. Now, as the world is open in some ways from the point of view of transportation, it's closed in other ways. Politically, it's closed, so that there can't be as many expeditions now. One was reported in the paper today. A young fellow named Erickson at the museum had made a great discovery about the way agriculture was done in Peru. And he figured from his excavations that this method had been forgotten before the Spanish came, but he revived it, and he found that it makes enormously greater yield in crops. And it's a great service to Peru, because they've had various kinds of trouble there, but it shows the application of ancient studies to modern life. He's a very fine person, and he and his wife had been living in a village in Peru while they were making these discoveries, and that's what makes all the difference. You get to know the villagers, and they're cooperative and helpful. And that's what I found so useful when I was in Turkey with Rodney Young. Although I'd had no experience in actual digging before, the workers were very friendly, and they'd invite me home, and they'd lend me horses to ride, and it was such a very friendly group, and I learned Turkish by using it. So that later when I came back here, I taught Turkish to several people who were going out on that dig, teaching them the kind of words to use on a dig and then the everyday things. I was very lucky because my mother, though American, was brought up in Germany and France and was completely trilingual in German, French, and English. And when I was a child, she spoke German to me until World War I, and then she spoke French to my sister and myself. So from childhood, I had the idea that there were other languages, other ways of thinking. And I've always thought of language kind of as a game. When I'm in a new country, I try to learn to read it if possible. I can read Turkish and Persian as well as Chinese and Japanese and Korean. And language is a great delight to me. I think it's a hobby, but so practical. There's the idea of being able to talk to people in their own way, even though it may be primitive. I had one student who was working in the Near East. I went to visit him when he was working in Morocco, and then later he was doing his PhD for Princeton in Yemen. He got to Yemen and he found that the way of speaking was much the same as in Morocco, because Yemenis had come to Morocco to conquer it centuries before. But he'd be in the middle of a conversation and suddenly people would look blank, or they'd just turn and walk away. He was somehow insulting them. He didn't know why. But being a very wise fellow, he just sat there in an inn and watched people as they talked for about as much as 2 weeks. And he found the hand gestures were totally different. So he was making rather insulting gestures without knowing it. But as soon as he learned the Yemeni way, they said, "You're one of us." And they adopted him into their tribes, and he became a tremendous success. But what a difference it makes. His hands were not keeping track with his mouth. He was saying two different things, and he had to learn that. So through him, I've learned that it's important to learn hand gestures too.
Did you have any experience working with Dr. Kramer?
I knew him rather well, and we were very good friends for a while. But there was a and he was extremely interesting. But there was a young fellow about my age named Francis Steele who had studied with Kramer. And Francis Steele made a great discovery, and it made Kramer intensely jealous. So Kramer arranged that Francis Steele must leave through Dr. Rainey. And Francis Steele had to leave. It broke his career just when it was at its coming to a height. And I could never really forgive that. And I said to Dr. Kramer that I thought it was a terrible thing to do, and Dr. Kramer would never speak to me again. If he did, it was very sarcastic, a dangerous enemy. And I think he sided with Rainey when I left. He was a man of great passion, passion and anger, at the same time passion in study. So he was one of the greatest scholars that Penn ever had. Dr. Kramer was one of the greatest scholars, but at the same time he had this irrational hatreds and likes and dislikes. It was hard to cope with him. I still have the greatest respect for Kramer's findings, and I think he revolutionized his field. In
what way?
Especially the Sumerians had not been very well known, and with his various writings he showed they were very human people with the same kind of problems we have in the present day. Students who would write home and ask the father for money, and about the folklore and the fables and just the daily life of the people of Samaria. I think he really brought them back, and then he's working with the Sumerian dictionaries. He made it possible for others to work. I think one of the great needs of scholarship is to make other people aware of a field, partly so they'll finance it, but partly so they'll think of people of ancient times as being human beings, of having the same way of thinking that we do, similar problems. And he had the gift of writing in a very delightful way. He avoided jargon. He would write in a friendly, humorous way. In fact, that was inspiration to me. I felt that when one makes a new discovery, it's important to express it in a friendly, open way that makes it accessible to a lot of people. Otherwise, it may take years for a scholarly idea to come down into the history books.
Going back, what do you think, do you recall some of the discoveries of the done through the University Museum that make the news, the headlines?
Oh, there were a great many discoveries, all the way back into the last century, when the museum began to collect a library of the old tablets of the Mesopotamian area. It made accessible a civilization that had been forgotten. It brought it back to life. And a great deal was done by Mr. Satterthwaite, who went down to the Mayan country, and he began some of the study of the Mayan calendar and things of that sort. And Linton Satterthwaite's superior was Dr. Mason, Alden Mason, and Mason was a very kindly old fellow who made remarkable discoveries in the Central American area. He studied very badly in English, but not when he was speaking Spanish. And he was in Yucatan one day, and he met a man in the street and stopped and asked him a question in Spanish. The man answered in English. And he said, "Why do you answer me in English?" And the man said in Spanish, I can't copy it exactly, but he said, "Because I stutter when I speak Spanish." and Dr. Mason had the ability to laugh at himself as well as everybody else. And he was such a likable man. We were very fond of him. In fact, he was kind of a link with the earlier past of the museum. Then there was Father Legrand, we used to call him Padre Legrand, who was a French Jesuit who had gone to work with Woolley in Ur. And he had enough work to keep him for 2 lifetimes, and he was always very busy in his study. But any time anyone passed, he'd call them in and chat happily, and then he'd say, "Now it's time for me to go, to get back to my work," and then you would just go. But through him, we learned a great deal about the Near East, through of the problems of digs, because Dr. Woolley, who was so very famous for his work at Ur, was a rather poor digger, actually. And Legrand would say that he got his stratas rather mixed, and his job was to try and straighten some of them out. But it showed you how really important the work of an archaeologist was after the dig was over, straightening out things. Then right opposite his office was Miss Wardle, and Harriet Newell Wardle. She'd been one of the founders of the American Anthropological Society, and perhaps there's no one in this continent, or perhaps even in Europe, who had the knowledge of Peruvian textiles and old Peruvian life. But being a very frail woman, she was about 5 feet tall and very thin. She always called herself H. Newell Wardle, so people would think she was a man. And people would come to the museum, "I'd like to see Mr. Wardle." "Well, there isn't a Mr. Wardle here, there's just a Miss Wardle." "Well, I'd like to see her." And they were very surprised to find this diminutive little lady with this vast knowledge.
But why did she...
At that time, she felt that anthropology was a man's work, and that she was kind of on the outskirts. Actually, she was in the center of the field, but she just had this timidity. We all liked her very, very much. In fact, we were very sad when she finally retired through old age, because she was a kind of a lively member of the museum family, and her knowledge was so great. She'd quietly remarked that she just made some discovery about a new weaving technique or something, and just as though she said, I had a cup of coffee for breakfast, just matter of fact, and actually it was a world-shattering discovery. It's something which would open out a whole new field of knowledge. But her deep humility, her quiet, low-key way of talking, we admired her greatly. I think that she should go down as one of the great people at the University Museum.